Claire Morgan didn't believe in fate, but she remembered the exact second her life changed. And it wasn't when her mother died last week, or when she became a single parent 5 years ago. It was the moment she heard a man behind her whisper something obscene, and felt a stranger next to her shift in his seat, like a fuse had just been lit. It happened 32 minutes after takeoff. She was seated in 22B on a full evening flight from Denver to New York, returning from a funeral with a suitcase of folded grief and a daughter sleeping softly at her side. The man beside her hadn't said much. He wore a dark hoodie and kept his gaze forward. Posture, quiet but watchful. The kind of stillness that didn't read as indifference but readiness. Claire hadn't paid much attention. She wasn't in the mood for small talk, and besides, she was used to doing things on her own. Then came the voice 2 rows behind her, low, wet with arrogance. "Bet you'd be warmer without that jacket." The man said behind her, "Why don't you take it off, sweetheart?" Claire froze. The words were said softly, but they dripped down her spine like cold oil. She didn't turn. She didn't respond. He said something else closer this time, and she felt it, a hand grazing the back of her seat, fingertips inching where they shouldn't be. She straightened, her voice firm. "Please don't touch me." Silence followed, then a mocking laugh from behind. The man beside her moved, unbuckling his seatbelt and rising smoothly, silently, like someone accustomed to immediate action. Claire barely registered his movements, but the way he positioned himself slightly in front of her and angled ready suggested this wasn't his first time in such a situation. The harasser smirked, hands raised. "Hey, take it easy, man. Just talking." "You need to stop," the stranger said quietly. The entire row seemed to hold its breath. "I said, back off." His words, though not loud or aggressive, were sharp, as if carved from stone. The man behind them laughed again. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The stranger tilted his head slightly, as if deciding whether to answer. Then he spoke. "I'm the last person you want to test at 30,000 feet. That was all it took. A nearby attendant, approached passengers had started whispering. Within minutes, the man behind Claire was being escorted to the back of the plane, swearing under his breath. The stranger sat back down. No victory grin, no dramatic gesture, just silence. Claire turned toward him slowly, her pulse still racing. "Thank you," she said. Voice soft but full. He nodded once. "You are welcome." She looked at him more closely now. Strong jaw, eyes alert, scanning the cabin, subtly, hands still resting steady on his lap. There was something about the way he carried himself. Not like someone trying to prove anything, more like someone who had already seen too much. "I'm Claire," she offered, still a little breathless. "Ethan," he said. "No last name, no questions. Just calm." And though she didn't know it yet, Claire had just met a man who didn't only serve his country. He would soon change the course of her life. The cabin had gone quiet again. The kind of quiet that lingers after something just barely avoided becoming worse. Claire sat motionless, one hand resting over Sophie's shoulder. Her daughter hadn't stirred during the entire exchange, still asleep, small chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Claire gently pulled the blanket higher, her fingers trembling slightly as the adrenaline wore off. Ethan hadn't moved since. He settled back into his seat, his gaze fixed straight ahead, feigning indifference to the recent incident. Yet, Claire observed the rigidity of his broad, square shoulders. They hadn't relaxed. He remained vigilant, analytical. "Do things like that happen often?" she inquired, her voice hushed. He turned to her, his movement just a touch too swift. A sense of calm enveloped him, not passive, but controlled, like someone who had long mastered composure amidst chaos. "Thank you," she repeated, her gratitude sincere. He offered the slightest nod. "You shouldn't have to say it. That kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone." Claire exhaled softly and leaned back, realizing the extent of her tension throughout the flight. After a few minutes of silence, she cast a sideways glance. "You don't exactly seem like a guy who works in tech that earned the slightest curve of a smile from him." "Why is that?" she shrugged. "Just a guess. You didn't hesitate the way you stood up. It felt like you'd done that before." Ethan was quiet for a beat. "Military," he finally said. She looked at him again. Really looked. The posture, the gaze, the calm. It all made sense now, Barry Air Force, he said. Then paused. Retired, sort of. Claire raised an eyebrow. Sort of. He didn't answer right away, just looked down at his hands for a second before turning back to her. Still do some work. Let's leave it at that, she nodded, understanding the line he'd just drawn. There were things he didn't say, and she wouldn't push. Another beat of silence past the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Switching to the soft amber of night mode, Claire folded her arms and exhaled slowly. I didn't think this flight would be the part of the week that scared me the most. Ethan turned to her rough trip, my mother's funeral. He nodded once. No awkward condolences. No cheap sympathy. I'm sorry, he said simply. Claire appreciated that. What about you? She asked. What brings you on this flight work? Mostly he didn't elaborate, and strangely, she didn't need him to. There was a shared silence between them. Not uncomfortable, more like the kind that exists between two people who understand things they don't need to explain. Sophie stirred slightly, shifting against Claire's arm. Claire smoothed her daughter's hair back and kissed the top of her head. Ethan's gaze lingered on the little girl for a moment. Your only one. Claire nodded. Sophie, 5 years old and somehow older than me, on most days. He gave a faint smile. She's lucky you're strong. She raised an eyebrow, almost amused. You gathered all that from watching me try to hold it together in seat 22B. No, Ethan said, from how fast you stood your ground. Claire stared at him for a moment, then looked away, not because she was embarrassed, but because the words had hit closer than she expected outside. The snow was still falling across the night. Skies swirling in the window like quiet chaos inside. Claire realized something for the first time in years. She wasn't carrying the weight of the moment alone. 2 tours later, the plane touched down on an unfamiliar runway. Snow was falling heavier now, slanting sideways in the wind as the aircraft taxied toward a small terminal. Claire peered through the window, confused by the lack of city lights. This isn't New York, she murmured. Ethan didn't respond right away, but he was already leaning slightly forward, reading the tension in the cabin, like a soldier scanning a map. The captain's voice crackled overhead. Ladies and gentlemen, due to worsening weather systems over the East Coast and airspace congestion, we've made an unscheduled landing at McKenzie Regional Airport in Nebraska. We'll be refueling and awaiting further clearance. We appreciate your patience. A wave of frustration swept through the rose-grown sighs. The quick tapping of phones trying to reconnect. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, the exhaustion catching up with her. A layover in the middle of nowhere, a funeral behind her, and her daughter still curled asleep against her side. She felt the spiral coming. Hey, Ethan's voice cut through. Gently breathe one thing at a time. She opened her eyes. You always this calm during storms? She asked. His lips twitched. No, I've just been through worse ones. A few moments later, the plane came to a full stop. The doors opened with a sharp hiss and freezing air rushed in. Passengers were given the option to deplane into the small terminal to wait. Claire hesitated. Sophie was still asleep, but Ethan had already stood up, reaching for her. Carry on. I've got it, he said without asking. Claire looked up at him. She didn't say no. The terminal was small, quiet, and smelled faintly of instant coffee, and tired air. Fold-out chairs lined the walls. A vending machine flickered near the far end. Ethan led the way, clearing a space in the corner where it was warmest. Claire sat down carefully, cradling Sophie in her lap. She'll be out for a while, Claire murmured. Ethan sat next to her, glancing around. Not the worst place I've been stuck. Claire followed his gaze. Bet it's not the best either. No, he agreed, smiling faintly. But at least here, nobody's shooting at us. She gave him a look. That a joke? He shrugged. Not really for a moment. Silence stretched between them again. But this one felt different. Not awkward, just full. Claire shifted slightly. He said you was still active consulting. Ethan replied, mostly off the record. I train teams, advise, handle sensitive assets. She raised an eyebrow. You make it sound like you're in a spy movie. His expression didn't change. Sometimes it feels that way. Before she could respond, a woman in a staff jacket approached with a clipboard. Sorry to interrupt. We're assigning hotel vouchers for families with children, prioritizing single parents due to limited space, the woman explained gently. Claire, blinking, confirmed. That would be, yeah, that's us. The woman nodded. Great. We're assigning shared shuttles to adults, with a maximum of 2 per room. So, if you're traveling alone, she's with me, Ethan interjected before Claire could speak. The woman gave him a quick glance, then wrote something on her clipboard and walked off. Claire turned to him, wide-eyed. You didn't have to, Ethan said calmly. I know, but I also know it's past midnight. You haven't slept, and you're not dragging a 5-year-old through more paperwork. Claire hesitated, then nodded. Thank you, she said again. And this time, it wasn't just about the room. The hotel wasn't much. Just a roadside stop with beige walls and thin carpet. But it was warm, and it was quiet. They were given a room with 2 queen beds. Claire tucked Sophie into one and stood for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Ethan set her suitcase down in the corner, then without a word took a step back and sat on the edge of the other bed. I can take the floor if that makes it easier, he said, his voice. Even Claire shook her head. It's fine. You've done enough. She sat across from him. There was a lamp between them, casting a soft golden light across the space for the first time that night. Neither of them had anywhere else to be. You always step in like that? She asked quietly, with strangers on planes, he thought. For a moment. No, he said. Only when I know what silence can cost. Claire didn't ask what that meant. She just watched him. The quiet posture, the measured words, the look of someone who had once made a promise they couldn't afford to break. She didn't know the full story, but for the first time she wanted to. It was nearly 1 a.m. outside. Snow danced under a flickering street lamp just beyond the hotel window. Inside the quiet room, Claire sat cross-legged on her bed, arms around her knees, facing Ethan across the space between them. Sophie was still asleep, breathing evenly in the other bed, one arm flung over her stuffed penguin. Claire's voice broke the silence. You said silence can cause something. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't rush to fill the space either. He just stared at the carpet for a long moment, like someone choosing the right memory out of a drawer, filled with ones he'd rather forget. Her name was Marissa, he said. Finally, Claire stayed quiet. She was a local interpreter. Afghanistan. Smart, fearless. Knew more about real courage than half the men I served with. He leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his thighs. There was intel. A threat we didn't act on soon enough. I didn't speak up. I waited. Wanted confirmation protocol. He looked at Claire, his eyes steady. She didn't make it. Claire felt the words settle in the room like dust. I'm sorry, she said quietly. She was 23. Ethan continued. Didn't flinch under fire. Didn't beg for help. She deserved better than my hesitation. Claire wanted to reach for something to say, but there was no answer to that kind of loss. She knew that space. The space where guilt lived without noise. Ethan sat forward again, elbows on his knees. So, when I see someone too afraid to speak, I don't wait anymore. Claire nodded slowly. She understood that not just the loss, but the shift that happens inside you afterward. The new kind of compass you carry forever, pointing toward what you should have done. She ran a hand through her hair when Sophie was born. I didn't know if I could do it. My mom was sick. Her father wasn't there. Ethan looked at her, waiting. Claire offered a half-smile correction. He left before she was born. I guess he was more in love with the idea of being a dad than the actual job. She laughed lightly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I stayed in my hometown for years. Took care of Mom, worked 2 jobs, didn't go anywhere, didn't date, just kept everything together. I thought that was strength. It is, Ethan said. I looked up at him. He held her gaze. You're still standing. That counts. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. She turned away slightly, blinking fast. Ethan stood quietly and crossed to the hotel mini-fridge. He pulled out 2 small water bottles and handed one to her. Hydration helps, he said with a soft smirk. She laughed, genuinely this time. Is that military wisdom? No, he replied. That's just what people say when they're too afraid to hand someone a tissue. She shook her head, smiling as she opened the bottle. Then, in a quieter voice, I don't usually talk to strangers like this. I don't usually sit in Nebraska hotel rooms with people I met 4 hours ago. Ethan replied, So we're even. Claire glanced at the clock. You should try to get some rest. He nodded. You too. He stood to switch off the light between the beds, pausing just a second longer than necessary. I meant what I said earlier, he added softer. Now you're strong even when you think no one sees it. Then he turned away, lay back on the bed, and closed his eyes. Claire laid down too, but sleep didn't come easily. She stared at the ceiling, listening to Sophie breathe, listening to the silence between her and a man who had shown up in her life like a locked door, swinging open in a storm. She didn't know what it meant yet, or if it meant anything, but for the first time in a long time, Claire Morgan didn't feel like she was carrying everything alone. And somehow, in the stillness of a snowy Nebraska night, that was everything. The next morning came quietly outside the motel window. The storm had passed, snow clung to car roofs and tree branches, like leftover memories, soft and fragile, under a pale gray sky. The shuttle to the airport arrived early, idling by the curb with fog swirling around its tires. Claire stood by the mirror, brushing out Sophie's hair while the little girl yawned and clutched her penguin. Ethan waited at the door, already packed his hoodie, zipped his gaze, distant the same way it had been when he first sat down beside her on the plane. He didn't say much during the ride back, neither did Claire. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Now it felt like something earned, a space where trust had settled in. By noon, they were back in the sky. No turbulence this time. No detours, no confrontations in row 22, just quiet. Sophie drew pictures in her seat. Ethan read something on his phone. Claire stared out the window, at the bright, expansive cloud and sky, trying not to think too hard about what came next. New York's characteristic clamor, the blare of horns, the constant motion, always greeted arrivals, though Claire had spent most of her life simply trying to endure it. This time, stepping off the plane, a different feeling emerged. She dreaded the farewell at baggage claim. Claire collected their suitcase while Sophie, with a practiced ease that made Claire pause, casually held Ethan's hand. Ethan noticed, gently releasing Sophie's hand. She's a strong kid, he remarked. Claire nodded in agreement. She gets it from her grandmother. An awkward silence settled between them, a space where strangers hovered on the brink of something more. Finally, Claire broke the quiet. Well, she said, thanks for everything. Ethan's gaze lingered on her, truly seeing her. Need a ride? He offered. She hesitated. No, we're good. My friend is picking us up. Ethan nodded. Okay. Claire extended her hand. Take care of yourself. He shook it firm and steady. You too. Then he turned and walked away. Claire watched him go, a strange tightness in her chest. Sophie looked up and asked, Will we see him again? Claire didn't answer. 3 days passed. Claire returned to her normal routine. Waking up early, packing Sophie's lunch, working long shifts at the clinic downtown. The rhythm of her life resumed like a song she hadn't realized she'd memorized. But something felt different. Her apartment felt quieter. The streets felt colder, not because the temperature had changed, but because she had that night. While Sophie was asleep, Claire opened her laptop and typed his name into the search bar. Ethan Cole. At first, nothing came up that looked like him, but then she found it. A press release. 6 years old. A blurred photo of him in uniform. Colonel Ethan Cole, decorated for leadership in a hostage recovery mission. Overseas details were sparse. Most of the story had been redacted. She stared at the screen for a long time. He hadn't told her any of that. Not the title, not the commendation. He had protected her like it was second nature. Not for praise, not for recognition, just because it was the right thing to do. Claire closed the laptop. Her heart was racing. The next morning, the doorbell rang at 8:01 a.m. Claire wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door slowly. Ethan stood there out of uniform. No suitcase, no shield of distance in his eyes, just him. I had some leave time stored up, he said. Thought I'd use it. Claire blinked. How did you? He held up his phone with a quiet shrug. Your address was on the luggage tag. I wrote it down just in case. There was no arrogance in the way he said it. Just simple honesty. A man who hadn't wanted to leave things unfinished. He reached into his jacket. Also, your daughter left something behind on the plane. He handed her a folded piece of paper. Sophie's drawing 3 stick figures holding hands. Claire looked at it, then back at him. She stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in! Ethan nodded once, stepped over the threshold, and just like that, something shifted. Again, not dramatically, not with fireworks, but with quiet certainty. Sometimes life reroutes you through places you never planned to go, and sometimes the detour turns out to be exactly where you were meant to land. The kettle whistled softly in the kitchen. Claire poured hot water over 2 mugs, the steam curling upward as she reached for the tea bags. In the living room, Sophie giggled at her own drawing, coloring in the stick figure, labeled Ethan with a bright orange crayon. Ethan stood nearby, hands in his pockets, scanning the framed photos on the shelf. Claire and her mom, Claire in scrubs, holding a newborn baby. Sophie's first steps caught in a blur. Everything in the apartment felt lived in and honest, not polished, not curated, just real. Claire handed him a mug, chamomile. It's the only thing I had. I've had worse, Ethan said, taking it with a nod. He sat down on the couch, looking slightly out of place in a space filled with pastel toys and warm blankets. But somehow he fit there too. Not because he tried to, but because he didn't. Claire sat across from him, wrapping her hands around her own cup. I still can't believe you came, he admitted. Then added, I wasn't sure I would either. His gaze shifted to Sophie, who was playfully making bunny ears with her hands as she sketched. Claire smiled. She doesn't easily let people in, but with you. It was as if she'd known you forever. He looked down for a moment, appearing uncomfortable with the compliment. I think kids can sense sincerity, he said. Claire took a quiet breath. A rare, peaceful calm settled between them. A peace she knew, however, didn't always last. A knock at the door broke the silence. Claire frowned. I'm not expecting anyone. She walked over and opened it. A man in a dark suit stood there tall, well-groomed with a badge clipped discreetly to his belt. His eyes shifted past Claire, landing squarely on Ethan. Colonel Cole. The man said. Claire's spine straightened. Ethan stood slowly, his entire posture changed. Shoulders squared, voice firm. I told command I was on leave. I'm not here for command. The man replied. I'm here because of the Cairo file. Ethan didn't blink. That file is sealed. Not anymore. Claire looked between them. What's going on? Ethan turned to her, his voice quieter. Now it's nothing. Just a formality. The man spoke. Again, you're not under investigation, Colonel, but we do need to ask you a few questions now. Ethan exhaled slowly, then looked back at Claire. I'm sorry, without another word. He stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind him. Claire stood there, motionless, her tea cooling in her hand. Sophie looked up. Where did Ethan go? Claire swallowed the knot rising in her throat. He had to take care of something outside. Ethan walked beside the agent in silence, snow crunching beneath their boots. The man finally spoke. You sure about this? Getting involved with civilians. Ethan didn't answer. He just kept walking. Not toward danger, not toward safety. The apartment felt different without him. Claire stood in the kitchen long after the door closed, the untouched mugs of tea still steaming faintly on the table. Sophie had returned to her drawings, unbothered, but Claire couldn't shake the look in Ethan's eyes before he left. It wasn't fear, it was resignation, like he'd been here before, walking away from something good before it got too close. She sat down, scrolling through the text thread she never started. His number was saved, but no messages had been exchanged since the day they parted at baggage claim. He hadn't left anything behind, no note, no explanation, just that look. That, I'm sorry. Claire wanted to believe it was just work, some unfinished duty calling him back. But that man at the door, the way he spoke, the words churro file, it didn't feel routine. It felt like a secret. That night after Sophie fell asleep, Claire found herself at her laptop again. She hesitated only a second before typing. Ethan Cole, Chiro file. At first, the results were vague. Then she saw it. A brief article, scrubbed of details, buried in the archives of a military watchdog blog. SEAL-linked operation in Cairo. Sparks quiet controversy. Civilian casualty rumors surface. No names, no confirmations, but one line stood out. Sources suggest that a decorated U.S. officer temporarily suspended operations after the mission, citing personal responsibility for a decision that cost the wrong person their life. Claire leaned back slowly. She thought of the way Ethan had spoken about Marissa, about waiting too long, about silence, having a cost. He had been talking about Cairo. He had been talking about her. But the next day passed without a word. By evening, Claire tried calling straight to voicemail. She debated texting, then deleted the message halfway through. It felt too small, too surface level for everything she wanted to say. Instead, she stood in the hallway outside Sophie's room, watching her daughter fall asleep with the same drawing still taped to the wall. 3 stick figures stood, one taller than the others, arms stretched wide. Claire wondered what Ethan would say if he knew they hadn't taken it down. She also wondered if he would ever return. He didn't come back the next day, nor the day after. A week passed. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, just after sunrise, Claire opened her front door to take out the trash and saw him at the bottom of the stairs. Still in the same hoodie, still with the same stillness. Only this time, he looked tired, not physically, but like someone who had stopped running. She froze. He didn't move. "I shouldn't have left the way I did," Ethan said. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping my past out of your life." Claire remained silent. "Not yet." He stepped forward. "But what I didn't realize is that maybe you weren't the one who needed protecting." A long silence passed between them. Then finally, Claire spoke. "What happened in Cairo?" Ethan looked down. "When I gave the order to move, a child was in the building. We didn't see her until it was too late." Claire's breath caught. He looked up again. "That's the thing about command. You live with decisions no one else remembers, but you don't forget. Not ever." Claire stepped aside. "Come in," he hesitated. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "You're not the only one who's had to live with ghosts." Ethan stepped over the threshold, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but permission. The door clicked shut behind them. Ethan stood just inside Claire's apartment, hands by his sides, like he didn't know whether to sit or keep standing at attention. Claire crossed the room slowly, watching him. He wasn't the same man who sat beside her on that plane. He wasn't even the same man who'd helped her carry her daughter through a snowstorm in Nebraska. He looked stripped down, honest in a way she hadn't seen before. "You didn't have to come back," Claire said. "I know," Ethan replied, but not coming back felt worse. She didn't speak, just watched. As he stepped forward and placed something on the table, his wallet, he opened it quietly and slid out a thin, dark green military eye. The lettering was sharp. The title beneath his name, Colonel, United States Air Force. "I figured it was time you saw it," he said. Claire looked down at the card, then up at him. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Ethan didn't flinch because I didn't want to be that guy on the plane. The uniform, the past, the weight. I wanted to be someone you looked at and didn't flinch. Claire took a slow breath. "I never flinched, Ethan. I just didn't know." He nodded. A quiet moment passed between them. Then Sophie came padding into the room, still in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. She blinked at Ethan, then grinned. "You came back." Ethan smiled, kneeling. "I said I would." Claire watched as Sophie threw her arms around him. It was so natural it hurt a little. When Ethan stood, Claire gestured toward the kitchen. "Come on, I'll make coffee." They sat at the kitchen table, while the coffee brewed, the air warm with quiet steam and something unspoken. "So what happens now?" Claire asked. Ethan looked at her, eyes steady. "That depends on you." She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "I've spent most of my life being deployed to wars, to missions, to people who needed me for something I could solve. But this," he gestured toward her apartment, toward Sophie's drawing, still on the fridge. "This isn't a mission. And I don't want to be here just because I saved you on a plane." Claire swallowed. I want to be here because I'm choosing it, Ethan continued. Not out of duty, but because this is the first thing in a long time that feels real. A silent stretch between them. Soft but full. Then Claire leaned forward. Elbows on the table, voiced low. Do you know what the scariest part of doing this alone has been? Ethan shook his head, knowing that if something went wrong, no one would know but me. That if I broke down at 2:00 a.m., no one would notice. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. I don't need a hero, Ethan. I just want someone who shows up. He met her gaze then. I'm already halfway there. Claire exhaled the tension, leaving her shoulders like a slow unraveling thread. She reached across the table, not with a declaration, not with a promise, but just her hand palm up. Ethan placed his over it. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was enough. That afternoon, Sophie, Ethan, and Claire went to the park. Sophie gleefully ran through piles of golden leaves while Ethan and Claire sat on a bench. Ethan had a quiet smile playing on his lips, prompting Claire to observe. You know she's drawing you into everything now, he responded. I'm apparently a superhero and a dinosaur in the same picture. Claire laughed. Ethan looked at her, and this time, his gaze was free from the burdens of his uniform, past mistakes, or unread reports. He seemed to have finally found his place, not geographically, but within his own life. As fall transitioned into early winter, the city grew dimmer each day. Claire's block settled into a quiet stillness, disturbed only by the crunch of leaves under hurried footsteps and the distant laughter of children bundled in scarves and mittens. Inside Claire's apartment, a comforting warmth prevailed. Things had found a rhythm, not perfect, not choreographed, but real. Ethan came by most evenings after training sessions on base. Sophie always ran to the door first, asking if he brought cookies or stories. Sometimes he brought both, other times just a look in his eyes. That said, it's been a long day, but I still wanted to be here. Claire started leaving the porch light on even before he texted. She never said it out loud, but he always noticed. One Friday afternoon, Claire's clinic held a community event. Flu shots, free screenings, a warm meal for those who needed it. She hadn't expected Ethan to show up. He didn't like being around crowds. Too many eyes, too many exits to track. But as she handed out forms near the front desk, she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. Civilian clothes, quiet presence. Sophie was beside him, holding his hand tightly and waving with her free one. Claire's heart caught in her chest. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to sleep, they sat together on Claire's fire escape with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Steam rose from their mugs. The city blinked and hummed below them today. Meant something to you, Ethan said. Claire nodded. It always does. He looked at her for a moment, then out at the skyline. You make it look easy. Claire smiled. It's not. I know, he said, that's why it's beautiful. There was a pause. Then Ethan reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. No fanfare, no speech, just a folded piece of paper. Claire took it carefully and opened it. Inside was a letter, formal, stamped, and official. His discharge papers, honorable, immediate. She looked up, confused. What is this? I'm done, Ethan said. With deployments, with disappearing, with living a life where everything is temporary except regret. Claire's eyes filled. But she didn't speak. I've served long enough to know what matters, and for the first time, I want to serve something I chose. He looked at her, his voice lower. Now I choose. His tears spilled before she could stop them, but her smile came with them. She whispered, I never asked you to give it all up. I know, Ethan said. But I want to because for once I'm not answering a call sign. He reached for her hand. I'm answering you. 1 year later, Claire stood at the front of a small auditorium. Sophie was graduating from her kindergarten class, beaming, holding a hand-drawn certificate, waving at her mom from the stage. Ethan stood in the back, quiet as always, but not hiding anymore. Teachers nodded at him. Parents smiled. Sophie ran straight into his arms. When the ceremony ended, Claire watched as Ethan knelt, lifted Sophie into the air and spun her once. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He didn't need it. Everything that mattered was already in his arms. Sophie reached for her mother as she walked over. The three of them stood together under a string of paper stars taped to the auditorium walls. In that moment, Claire finally understood something she hadn't on that flight a year ago. Sometimes, the hero in your story isn't the one who arrives with glory. It's the one who stays. If this story resonated with you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet heroes in your life, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We share powerful stories like this every day.